So tell us about the impact of venture investing on the startup ecosystem. Tell us about what is the current VC landscape in 2024? What are the key trends, challenges, and what is changing?
LPs are not letting go of their money, which means the VCs aren't funded as well, which means the entrepreneurs aren't getting as much funding as they would have in the past. People talking about their product, like nonstop product, like here's my login screen. Nobody needs to see your login screen, like when they're doing a pitch deck. Like there is an assumption that there is a login.
Hey listeners, welcome to 10x Growth Strategies podcast. This is your host Preethy Padmanabhan, technology executive, investor, and board member. Today, we will feature the book Secrets of Sand Hill Road by Scott Kupor. Our guest today is Mercedes Bankston, program director for the Founder Institute. Mercedes is a seasoned executive with over 20 years of experience in sustainability, venture acceleration, and global partnerships. Recognized as LinkedIn Top Venture Capital Voice, she has launched startups across the US, EU, and UK and mentored thousands of pitches annually. Her work spans sectors like healthcare and fintech, driving growth and innovation. As a venture partner and capital advisor, Mercedes is committed to impactful leadership and sustainable business practices. Welcome, Mercedes, to 10x Growth Strategies podcast.
Thank you so much, Preethy.
Tell us about yourself, the key highlights from your journey.
Yeah, so from a quick background standpoint, I started as an exit entrepreneur in my 20s, and then I went corporate working for Cisco, NEC, Oracle. A lot of those companies I worked with startups that we ended up merging and acquiring over time to help us fuel our sales. And then at some point, I moved back to Europe. I was working on a digital project for McGraw-Hill Education, dealing with ministries around the world, and decided that I was just ready to go back into the startup world just because corporate was so slow. And since then, I have invested in quite a few startups, mentored thousands, and watched them launch from obviously the UK and the EU, and most recently California.
Fantastic. Wow, you've mentored thousands of startups. That's amazing. I've mentored like a handful, maybe 20 startups, right? And you've done so much. I'm excited to talk to you. Looks like we have more in common than I realized. I also worked at Cisco. So looks like we're crossing paths again. You had suggested this book, Secrets of Sand Hill Road, and I really enjoyed reading it. Tell us, why did you choose to read this book?
Well, I think when it came out, it was such a huge book for the time, right? So it really explains to entrepreneurs the mentality behind a venture capitalist. So particularly when you're a startup, and oftentimes first-time entrepreneur, second-time entrepreneur, you don't understand like what a VC is looking for. And so they make these like crazy assumptions. One of those first crazy assumptions is, hey, I can go raise funds like millions of dollars just off an idea. And that just isn't reality. Very few people can do that, right? But the people who can do that, they have some very recognizable credentials. Maybe they've done something before that's fantastic. So a great example of that in today's climate is Ilya. He left ChatGPT or OpenAI, and he raised $1 billion basically on an idea for safety. But he's a subject matter expert, right? He worked at one of the hottest startups in the world. And so people, of course, are going to back him moving forward. Not to mention, we do need safety components on AI. But for an entrepreneur, your run-of-the-mill entrepreneur, to think that they can go raise $1 billion or $1 million just by walking into a room and saying, hey, here's my idea. I don't have any customer traction. I don't have anybody who's validated this. I'm not really a subject matter expert. It's just not reality. And every day I come across entrepreneurs like this. And this book is a great framework to give to them and say, hey, like, let's restructure your thinking. And then to take a step further, people that are raising money, even if they've raised before, they don't necessarily understand like what a venture capitalist really wants. What are their motivations? They don't understand that there's venture capital thesis, which generally tell you the location, the size of the fund, what they invest in. So you oftentimes see startups like running out to like every VC, and you'll have like a consumer product startup try to reach out to a healthcare VC, and they'll pitch, but they don't recognize like why it's going to fall flat on its face. And so the reason I recommend this book essentially is to prevent those type of mistakes.
Great. What I'm hearing is that knowing your audience, because as an entrepreneur, you need to know who you're pitching to. I'm hearing that, and also to know what it takes to raise capital. It's not a slam dunk all the time, so that is great advice. And certainly entrepreneurs need that. And the very little investing I've done, bunch of angel investing, 20-30 companies, and but even there, the scrutiny that as an investor, that as an angel investor I do is a lot. I can imagine how much more happens in the VC world. So tell us, what are your top takeaways from this book?
Well, this is like such a loaded question, because there's quite a bit. I mean, I think it's really important for people to understand how VC works. And I think there's a different mentality from Europeans than there are to Americans on how to go about this market. So when we look at startups in Europe, they tend to be operationally conducive, right? So they have lower burn rates. They know their numbers really well. They're not as big of a dreamers. They tend to be in solid markets like fintech or insurance tech, very legacy type environments. Whereas in the United States, we have really high burn rates with long-term trajectories. And that's why there is so much need for venture capital in the United States. Because when you have a high burn rate, you're not going to be in business for a long time. So you go to a VC to help manage that capital and to get clear expectations about how it will be evaluated. So I think that kind of is a number one, is like, what is the difference and like why we need VC? And then understanding really how they make those decisions. A VC, it's interesting. So they say like 80% of, or I guess 1 out of 80 companies is going to be a home run for a VC. That means like 79 of them will be a failure. And so each VC is betting on that one company, or all the companies in their portfolio, that there will just be kind of one that is going to be the highlight that's going to provide sizable returns. So they have to really make that decision very carefully, and spend a lot of time looking into the founder credibility, the revenue model, assessing the team dynamics, the market size, the growth potential. And so they want to achieve massive returns, outsized returns. And, entrepreneurs don't necessarily understand that, right? They don't necessarily understand that this VC is looking at 100 companies or even 5 companies, and they choose to go with the one that they think is going to provide the biggest return. And it could be the biggest return, comparably to the other 5 companies that are in the queue. You can have an excellent company and it can get bypassed just because there's someone with a better market opportunity. And that's okay. Like, you just got to move on with your life. I think the other interesting aspect that we didn't really talk about in this book is the number of investments. So some VCs invest in hundreds. Some invest only like 5 to 8 a year of entrepreneurs. And that's a problem because, if you're whittling down to the top 8 companies and thinking like, I'm going to make my big bet on like one of these, there's a lot of competition.
Absolutely. No, you brought up some really good points. I love the fact that because you have this global experience, the way you talked about how are startups being conceived in Europe versus the US, and there's a lot of focus on profitability and those aspects. And of course, with COVID and all the downturn that happened the last few years, even in the US, people are like having a closer look. So that angle of business profitability. You also brought up this really good point about how many companies do the VCs invest in total, right? They might get 1,000 applications or more, but if they only invest in 5, then your chance of getting an investment is way less. So really good points out there that you raised. So we've talked about the book, we've talked about venture investing. So tell us about the impact of venture investing on the startup ecosystem. There are a lot of studies done. Would love to hear your perspective from the book and also outside if you have additional thoughts.
Geez, I don't know these numbers offhand, but startups are huge drivers of the employment rate and providing people jobs. Because startups need capital, venture capitalists really are the ones responsible for that, because without the startup getting VC money, they wouldn't have tons of jobs, right? Oftentimes a startup, again, is burning money. So when a VC invests, it's not necessarily because the employee is, paying their salary or their fully loaded cost. And I think that's really important to think about because the number of startups, at least in the US market, have really provided millions of jobs. One of the things it drives me crazy, and this is no longer a startup, but Amazon, lost money for years, but people really criticize them for not paying taxes. But if you look at what the employment taxes and the personal taxes that are associated with those jobs, it actually brought in more money than if Amazon didn't have the write-offs that they did, as well as the capital gains that those employees received. And I think today you can look and say like, hey, like Amazon has tons of drivers, they have tons of people in the warehouse, they have tons of people in marketing, tons of people in the payment systems, as well as like their own like manufacturing, like they're manufacturing products. They have tons of salespeople and tons of people in operations. It's one of the biggest companies that's grown in recent years. But again, they started as a startup. And startups, the nature of a company is it should grow and hopefully it becomes like very successful. And so for like a small startup to begin and go through that growth trajectory, to have lots of employees, that's phenomenal. But what is really happening with like larger corporates? My parents came from big corporate companies and they don't seem to be growing at the same pace. They're not hiring as many people. And yes, they're like on the stock market, raising money in that capacity, but it seems to go up and down. Startups, like I said, have a lot of growth to do in the very beginning. And then at some point they exit being that startup mode and become more corporate.
Yeah. I certainly think it's more fun to be in the startup side of the house, right? So I completely resonate with what you're saying, right? It's faster growth and more nimble. So great impact out there, and on the how the venture world is shaping the business. I loved your Amazon example too. I also wanted to call upon the fact that what you said, right? The number of jobs that have been created, even with Amazon at all levels, right? Because we're not just talking about the top 2% of jobs, the number of people who are given employment. Certainly, that is like really commendable. Regarding the study, I'll quickly mention for the audience, right? The last 30 years, 42% of US IPOs have come from VC-backed companies. This is a 2015 study that was done by Stanford University and University of British Columbia. And there have also been some Kaufman studies done in 2010, about 25 million net jobs created, right? So that's so certainly what you mentioned with respect to creation of jobs and the innovation and the growth and IPO makes a lot of sense to invest in the startup ecosystem. Obviously, we have seen a lot of changes the last 3 years. We've seen ups and downs. Tell us about what is the current VC landscape in 2024? What are the key trends, challenges, and what is changing?
Well, I think AI has just taken companies by like a firestorm, right? So we're about 2 years into AI. So legacy companies are figuring out how to embed AI into their processes. Startups are taking off with AI and building a startup that doesn't need a lot of employees. What you can do today is very different than what you could do 2-3 years ago. And it's funny because I was talking to someone the other day and they're like, the company I'm building now, I only need like 5 people, whereas previously I needed 100, right? And he's essentially building the exact same company that he had before he sold it to a big television station. And it's just interesting. It's interesting to watch. Like, we're a lot more efficient. We can get data at our fingertips. We don't need as many designers. So I think AI just in general, we'll see what happens, but there's a lot of venture capital investments and there's a lot of startups that are being made every week. And the question is like, where will that change the game? Like, are those VC investments all going to fall flat because they didn't adopt AI fast enough, or because startups overtook growth from legacy companies? That's quite possible. I mean, I don't know. I think when we talk about the current landscape, it's abysmal, right? Like, getting capital is very hard right now. The summer months are always very sluggish. September is also a very sluggish month, and it will start to increase. But, I've heard lots of varying factors. One being that this is a very political year. And so people are trying to see like what's going to happen with their tax base. Will they end up with like huge capital gains? Will they have changes in corporate tax? I don't think 2024, any of that's going to change. I think that's a outlook for 2025 and past. But I think, LPs are not letting go of their money, which means the VCs aren't funded as well, which means the entrepreneurs aren't getting as much funding as they would have in the past. So it's tough, right? And in a world where I think I read that there were 400 or 4,000 new AI startups starting every month. In that particular case, there's a lot of competition. There's a lot going on. And so we're accelerating the number of entrepreneurs that are out there. So there's lots to look at, and there's also lots to fail. So we'll see what happens. Like, this is just going to be a big shakeout in the next couple of years.
Absolutely. And I know that you're in Founder Institute and in VC Lab, you're playing such a pivotal role in that impact you're creating. I was super impressed by like the number of startups you've helped, and even like half of the VCs that are coming out of a VC Lab, or pretty much half the VCs in the world are trained by VC Lab. Would you like to talk anything about Founder Institute and VC Lab? The audience would love to hear.
Sure. So Founder Institute is an accelerator to take people from an idea essentially to launching their company. We do kick people out of the program because they're not validated. They maybe aren't the right person to like take the company forward. Just because you come up with the idea like Blockbuster or Netflix doesn't mean that you're actually the person to like run with it. And actually bringing those two companies up. So Blockbuster, I think we all knew Blockbuster at one time, where you could rent like VHS. and then, DVD. And they actually had a team to go streaming wise, but that team was not the right team to like take streaming forward. And so it fell flat on its face. And that's like a great example of like, hey, they had an entire market. They had this like capture, but they didn't have the team to, take it to the next level. And so as a result, they went to the wayside, and Netflix like ran with that market. And so when we look at founders, like, are they the right person? Can they get in front of people and get a following? Do they have the right talent, right? Not all entrepreneurs are fantastic, and they need to get a co-founder or a team that, essentially has strengths that they don't necessarily have to help propel the company forward. And then from a founder institute perspective, obviously, like once they exit the program and they graduate, hopefully that they can like take off like Udemy did, or Fight Club. There's quite a few companies that have gone through the portfolio that are fantastic. And then from that aspect, like where do they get VC funding? VC Lab was created out of Founder Institute because we had so many exited founders that said, hey, I don't want to be another entrepreneur. We just want to invest again. And so the biggest need, was to change VC funding. There's lots of entrepreneurs right now. They all look a little bit different. VC has traditionally been a very legacy, purebred type market, I would say. And there's lots of people like yourself who have been angel investors, and they want to invest in something a little bit more special. Maybe they want venture funding behind them. They want to take it to like the next level. And so, being able to network with LPs, understanding how to start your own fund. Creating a fund used to be like $400,000. Now, like we can do it in the $50,000 range through VC Lab. And I'm seeing amazing funds come from there. Like some of my favorites are, there's a woman that comes from an area that the water causes cancer, pretty much the Erin Brockovich story. And she's like, I'm only investing in water startups because I know so many people that have cancer just from the water that they're drinking. And that's such a beautiful mission, right? It's very specific. Like, I fund water startups. Doesn't get more specific than that. And then there's someone else whose husband died of ALS, and she's a Stanford researcher, only doing things with the brain. And so she invests in essentially brain startups that help change the world, essentially. So these very narrow venture capitalist funds are coming out, and I think that makes a big impact on like the world, where you can sit there and say like, hey, like I'm only funding, a certain demographic within climate change or within sustainability and plastics, and really being a subject matter expert not only in your fund but also within the founders that you're meeting.
That's amazing. Like I can just, one word, if I was to say, you're democratizing the whole aspect of venture investing, right? And especially with such unique funds coming out of it, then there is actually options and opportunities for new areas of where it's not being served. Like we don't want 1,000 AI startups and nobody working on water or solving some of these really chronic diseases. And so I think that's phenomenal. I thank you for sharing all those examples of startups like Udemy and Fight Club, as well as these funds by these unique fund managers and investors. It really makes me very happy to hear about the impact that you're creating. I'd love to take a turn to talk about the future. Tell us about the future outlook for venture investments and startup fundraising. What sectors are hot over the next 5 years, and why do you think so?
From a VC standpoint, obviously, I'm not a fortune teller. But I do think emerging managers are going to continue to outperform larger funds. So emerging manager oftentimes is on their first fund. they have to be very critical about the type of startup entrepreneurs that they support. And the reason for this is they don't have opportunity to fail, right? They don't have a track record, but they're creating smaller funds and they're going into pre-seed, seed, sometimes Series A, depending on who they are. And I think that's going to be the way moving forward. The biggest problems that we see with entrepreneurs like going getting funding, other than the idea that they can raise off an idea, is the fact that they go to like 300 different VCs and they recognize that they're pitching to all the wrong VCs, right? Only 50 of them are correct. And I think at this point in time, we're able to kind of triangulate it and say, hey, you have a water startup. These are like water funds, or these are sustainability funds, or maybe even a health fund. Like there is like some crossover. And the idea that you could just like send that information over and for the VC to say, hey, this is like in my wheelhouse or not. Or you might want to go look at this other VC that is more relevant, might be the way to go. So like I said, I think emerging managers within venture capital are going to continue to pave a path. I think entrepreneurs are going to start to understand that there aren't, just 300 funds to go after, that they're going to go after 50 and like really whittle it down so they don't waste their time. And I think the VC market will pick back up as far as like funding. I haven't really looked at the numbers on how much was funded last year. It's a very wide open market. I know that there's a lot of companies that report on this, but they're not necessarily always accurate. And I think you just have to keep on moving forward. So if you're not getting funding and you're an entrepreneur, definitely go read The Secrets of Sand Hill Road. But then the second aspect is make sure that operationally your company can run by itself and that you understand your numbers. Because if you don't know your numbers, then do you really know your business?
Yeah, absolutely. That's so true, right? As an entrepreneur, you first make sure your fundamentals are figured out in your company, like rather than just, if you're bringing in a VC and you're infusing capital, you're adding more stakeholders into that whole mix. But are you ready for it? Very good thoughts on that. And I'm hopeful, right? What you're talking about, that if the VC landscape as well as the investors, like LP landscape is going to change, that would be positive for everybody. Any final insights for the audience here?
I would say if you're an entrepreneur and you haven't received funding in 90 to 120 days, you're doing something wrong, right? So either there's something drastically wrong in your pitch, there's something wrong in your company, whatever the case is, go back to the beginning and maybe join an accelerator. There's lots of different accelerators. They all range from, good to bad, as there is with anything else. And go find a good one to help you like fix the problems. I can't tell you how many founders have come to me throughout the years where they had like 400 clients and they're like, it's just not taking off. And I don't understand why. And we started to like peel back the onion, so to speak. And we're like, well, you actually don't know your market, right? You don't know who your customer is. You're just throwing marketing dollars at something, trying to get it to take off, when you could be a lot more effective and just really narrow down on exactly what that demographic looks like, and have a higher hit rate, like 80%. So I think that's like part of it. Some founders just don't know how to pitch, or they don't actually know really what goes on the pitch deck. I mean, I can't tell you how often I look at these pitch decks and I just like die inside. Because they're so bad. They're really so bad. And I had someone like very recently criticize me on LinkedIn when I saw the Reid Hoffman video of like his avatar, his AI avatar, going to meetings, judging competitions and things of that nature. It was a test that he did. I was like, I would really love an AI avatar just to meet with like entrepreneurs and their pitch decks. And someone was like, well, that's essentially not cool because like, you're not giving like one-on-one personalized attention. And it's like, I repeat the same stuff over and over again because you guys all make the same mistakes. Like, it doesn't change that often. And so if I had like an AI avatar, I'd go through the pitch deck, talk to them about like what's wrong, come back to me when you fix it, and then I'll have like that one-on-one conversation. But some of these mistakes are like very simple. Like, oh, let's use a size 8 font on a pitch deck. Contrary to popular belief, like not everything is digital, right? So VCs oftentimes print out your pitch deck, and if they can't like see it, like that's horrible. But let's take it a step further. If it's on a black background, what does that look like when it's printed out on a black and white sheet of paper? It looks like a sea of black, and it's not going to get attention simply because nobody wants to look at it. These are very simple things that I see all the time. And even I see it in like Series A founders. You would be amazed at like just the repeat volume of problems. Or people talking about their product, like nonstop product, like here's my login screen. Nobody needs to see your login screen like when they're doing a pitch deck. Like there is an assumption that there is a login. And so, I mean, it's so amazing. Or like there's a deck I saw the other day that starts out talking about the problem within small and medium-sized businesses, but they're companies for enterprise. I'm like, well, this actually doesn't relate. Like, you've got to change it. And it's that type of advice that a VC will pick up on, or a mentor will pick up on an accelerator and say, hey, like, this doesn't make sense. Like, you've got to change it. So yeah, I'm totally all about having an AI avatar to like help founders like make their way so they're actually investable moving forward.
Sounds good. Maybe we should even get the founders an AI avatar who can then correct it, they can use on their own to correct it, right?
Maybe.
Yeah. That's awesome. Yeah, great inputs. I love the candid feedback. Certainly that is very essential for founders to get a clear understanding of what needs to happen for them to be successful. Thank you, Mercedes. We really appreciate your time. Audience, check out the book, Secrets of Sand Hill Road, and thank you for tuning in today.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much, Preethy.